Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's curatorial introduction to the exhibition Reflections, Contemporary Art of the Middle East and North Africa at the British Museum. For anyone who would like to use the live captioning, there is a CC closed caption button that can be turned on in Zoom. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Louisa Macmillan, and I am currently Head of Research and Archives at Azzawi Art, the London studio of the Iraqi artist Dia Al-Azzawi. Many years ago, my journey into this field began after my sister and I visited the British Museum to see the extraordinary exhibition Word into Art in 2006. It is no exaggeration that that exhibition changed my life. Soon afterwards, I met its curator, Venetia Porter, whom it is my very great pleasure to introduce tonight, and I eventually persuaded her to let me join the Department of the Middle East, first as a volunteer and later as a curator. Around the time I started working at the British Museum, the international art market had just woken up to modern and contemporary Middle Eastern art, not wholly coincidentally, as Word into Art was the first exhibition of its kind in a Western museum. And in 2009, Venetia came up with the brilliant idea of setting up the Contemporary and Modern Middle Eastern Art Acquisition Group, or CaMMEA for short. I was fully on board with this idea from the outset, as Venetia and I had spoken at great length about the vital importance of the British Museum, the greatest museum of the history of mankind, being able to acquire works on paper that spoke about an increasingly troubled region in increasingly turbulent times. We were both frustrated that, although the museum was willing to acquire works, it seemed unable to keep up with the remarkable urgency of commercial Middle Eastern art sales since the art of the region had moved into the international spotlight. Moreover, we found that the artworks that immediately responded to what was happening in the region were some of the most telling reflections of the social and historical changes that were taking place in real time. And those are the works we felt most deserved to be in the museum's collection. When I left the British Museum in 2012, I was so impressed with what had been achieved in 3 years that I decided to become a member of the very group I had worked on during its formation. And so I joined CaMMEA as a patron. Our numbers have since grown alongside those of the artworks in this impressive collection. And now we are delighted that Venetia is able to display some of these to the public in this excellent book and the dedicated exhibition in Room 90 and the Al-Bukhari Gallery, both called Reflections. I would urge any of you who have not yet seen the book to get your hands on a copy immediately. It is available from the BM Bookshop, and the link is in the chat, and other online retailers, not least as there is some overlap with the exhibition, which will in turn be open to the public as soon as circumstances allow. But the book is available right now. I feel confident in speaking on behalf of my fellow CaMMEA patrons in saying that we are all honoured and overjoyed to have played a part in how this collection has grown over the years. And we hope that you will enjoy seeing some of the artworks in this presentation, as well as in the physical exhibition itself later in the year, inshallah, and of course in the book too. I encourage anyone to submit questions about the exhibition and the book as we go along, using the Q&A function on Zoom. I will not be able to field the chat box, so please do not use that for questions. And without further ado, I am delighted to hand you over to Venetia to tell us more.
Thank you, Louisa, so much for your absolutely lovely introduction. You've been part of my life for such a long time and part of CaMMEA and all the work that we did together. And it's a huge thank you to you for agreeing to do this introduction and for all of your work and the work of the CaMMEA patrons all of these last years. I also want to thank my colleagues Hilary, Vicky, Morgan, who's going to be moving the slides on, and my colleagues on the IT side, and so many others who've made this event happen. So this is an introduction to the exhibition, which will open, as Louisa said, when we're able. Hopefully, we think it's soon after May the 17th. It's an exhibition drawn from the BM collection and consists of works on paper that we have principally collected during the last decade, thanks in large part to the support of this wonderful patrons group, which we call CaMMEA. This collection sits mainly in the Department of the Middle East, where my desk is. And so the first thing I'm going to do in this presentation is to discuss what we mean by this regional term, Middle East and North Africa. The exhibition runs across 2 spaces in the museum, as Louisa's mentioned. Excuse me, in room 90 on the north side of the British Museum, where you will generally find beautiful exhibitions from the Prints and Drawings department, whose collection largely consists of Western art. And then there is a further important group displayed in the Al-Bukhari gallery. I'm going to show you pretty well everything that is going to be on display. So I'm going to be moving very fast, highlighting the themes and pausing at some specific works. There are about 100 works altogether, and the majority are included in the book that Louisa has so kindly mentioned to you. And I want to say that it is a book and not a catalogue of the exhibition. But before I start, I want to pay a huge tribute to my many colleagues who've made the exhibition happen in what have been complex circumstances. The word we are all now familiar with is challenging. And all of this includes design, conservation, mounting, framing, installing, producing labels, work on the website, organizing events like this and others that will follow, and so much else. And actually, this work that we've all done, this wonderful core team at the British Museum, has been extraordinary in really providing us with a beacon of normality in the midst of this turbulent time for all of us. Now, first, let us tackle what we mean by Middle East and North Africa. This is the so-called MENA region, which really ranges from west to east, goes from Morocco to Iran, with pretty well every country, with every country in between. I'm aware that it's not an ideal term, fraught as it is with colonialist overtones. However, I find that for the moment it provides a useful framework and reflects that within this sweep of geography, there is a vast history going back thousands of years in which we've seen the birth of civilizations, of writing, of literature, of art, and of faiths. In living memory, however, this region has seen much conflict, massive suffering on a human level, and destruction of culture. So much of this so sadly continues. So while the artists that I'll be speaking about inhabit the globalized world of art, they also reflect connections on multiple levels with the regions from which they come from, in complex, fascinating and subtle ways. So some of them will still live in the countries of their birth, but others are now in diaspora. There is no one narrative here, but a myriad of stories, and it's some of these that I hope to highlight with you today. And just on this slide, you begin to get a sense of it. We have our lead image, Huda Lutfi's Kulthum, the great icon, the Edith Piaf of the Middle East. And then on the other side, we have Taysir Batniji's Man in Front of an Impossibly Large Suitcase, a migration story that is such a feature of our times and which I'll return to at the end. Next slide, please. I'm going to start first with room 90. And this work by the Iranian artist Niki Nujumi is very large scale. And it's the work that confronts you before you even enter the exhibition. So what we see is a group of men gathered aggressively around one lone man in a chair against the backdrop of a car crash. Now, there are lots of misconceptions about what the art of the Middle East actually is. The common one is that it all stems from Islamic art and that there are no figures. I was keen that we should shatter that misconception immediately and to begin to give a sense of layers of meaning that are inherent in the works. By scratching the surface, as I hope to show you, stories begin to emerge. So the man in the chair, for example, that often appears in Niki Nujumi's work is a reference to how he was questioned repeatedly by Savak, the secret police, on his return to Iran from the United States in 1974, a deeply troubling experience that has informed all of his subsequent work. Nujumi lives in New York and has lived in New York for decades and is one of many Iranian artists in diaspora, as are the two next artists who are also from Iran. Next slide, please, Morgan. Thank you. Now, when we enter room 90, the works are grouped into two themes initially, the figure and abstraction, introduced by these two works. And further on is a large section that we've called Tangled Histories, in which we see snapshots of the politics of the region as they have been played out. Now, with these two works, you can see further complexities. Samira Abbasi, on the left, was born in Ahwaz, a part of Iran with strong connections to the Arab world. In her Frida Kahlo-like figure, she always represents herself. The words and the titles of the songs of Kulthum in Arabic are woven into her dress, while in Persian are words at the top from a medical manuscript. Now, on the other side, the patterns on Parastu Furuha's prints look like designs on carpets, but look deep and you'll see scenes of violence. This is a reflection of the way she's been affected by her own story. Her parents, activists and intellectuals, Darush and Parvaneh Furuha, were assassinated in Iran in 1998. She lives in Berlin. Next slide, please. Now, the first group of works in the exhibition, in this part of the exhibition, are by artists born in the early decades of the 20th century. At this time, there were art schools springing up across the Middle East and North Africa, and many of the artists started from there and then went on to study abroad, often on government scholarships. It was in the art schools of Rome and Paris that they learned figure drawing, along with landscape and perspective. Druby, and it was not actually easy to do this at home. Druby and Gregorian are each major figures. Druby, who also went on to found art movements in Iraq and to teach at the Institute of Fine Arts, recalled how his parents warned him against sketching human figures when he was a child, afraid that a spirit might come and breathe life into his drawings. Undeterred, he taught life drawing in his studio in Baghdad. Gregorian, on the other side, also studied in Rome. He's a major figure in Iran. He started the Tehran Biennial in 1958. And these drawings, I feel, are so intimate. And it's interesting to me that the figure on the chair in the top right, that she has objects around her that could have come from the Tehran Bazaar. Next slide, please. Now, this is a great Lebanese artist, Shafi Aboud, who first studied at the École de Beaux-Arts in Beirut and then in Paris, and he went on to gravitate between Beirut and Paris. He was also part of what's called the École de Paris. He spent time in Paris in the studios of André Lotte and Fernand Léger. He's principally known as an abstract artist, but he painted the nude on and off all of his life. He's the first artist in the Middle East to make artists' books, and this one, picture of which you see on the left, he made in the studio of the French printmaker and lithographer Edouard Goeg, and he's called Le Bouna, the priest, and it's a folk tale about two brothers, Mur, meaning bitter, and Helu, meaning sweet, and their trials at the hands of the evil priest, Bouna. He learnt this story from his grandmother in the village of Mhaidsi, north of Beirut, where he spent much of his time, much of his life, much of his childhood, sorry. Next slide, please. Now, Michel Baspous was a sculptor, also Lebanese. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Beirut, like Aboud, and later went to Paris. He spent time in the studio of Ossip Zadkine, and those of you who've been to the Zadkine Museum might recognize some similarities with his work. His drawings are generally preparatory drawings for sculptures, which can be seen in the garden of his house at Roshana above Beirut. And it was it's a glorious place, which he turned into a cultural center that flourished in the days before the 15-year-long civil war, which began in 1975. Next slide, please. Marwan is another of the great figures, born in Damascus, moved to Berlin in 1957, where he was to spend the rest of his life. He wanted to study art in Syria, but there was no art school in Syria at this point. And he then went on to Berlin. He studied in the studio of the famous teacher, Han Trier, and one of his contemporaries was Georg Baselitz. Over the years, he increasingly made studies of the face and the head. And here, the one from 1973 on the left is called Face Landscape. And you can see mountains and rivers etched in. Then the head became gradually more and more abstract, as you can see from the one on the right. Next slide, please. Now, I learned of the work of this artist, Yehuda Bakon, after I had finished the book, and this is housed in our prints and drawings department. He's an extremely interesting artist. He's a Holocaust survivor, born in Moravia in 1927. He moved to Palestine in 1946 and studied and later taught at the Bezalel School in Jerusalem, which was founded in 1906, initially as a school of arts and crafts. Much of his work evokes the trauma of his experience in the camps. And in 4 figures that you see on the right, he summons the memory of his family. His father, Isidore, his mother, Etel, and elder sister, Hannah, who perished in the concentration camps, and his younger sister, Rivka, who, like Yehuda, survived the war. And this protective arm is an allusion, may be an allusion to Bakon himself. Next slide, please. The last work in the sequence by artists who are referred to as modernists takes us to Tunisia, and these sketches by Noureddin Khayashi, who studied in Rome, and he was later to become a very well-known painter like his father Hedi. Noureddin is regarded as a painter of Tunisia, and this painting that you see on the postage stamp is very typical of the work that he would make, so here he is being commemorated in this way. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you now some works which are to do with the figure, which are more contemporary and tell other stories. So here we have Hav Kahraman, whose remarkable and haunting works on canvas will be known to many of you. This work too is very haunting and is called Honor Killing, drawing attention to this terrible act perpetrated on women accused of breaking social conventions. And governing gender relations, of course. And the women face all in the same direction, wearing their hijab in diminishing sizes, going up the tree. Next slide, please. Another issue highlighted here is that of literacy, or the lack of it in communities that Laura Bushnak has highlighted in her work. Assisting at these projects, she then asks the women why they wanted to read and write and what it has done for them. And this is one example here, the text that you can see on the screen. And Bushra is one of the speakers in an event we're doing in April, so do look out for the events that are going to be forthcoming these coming weeks. Next slide, please. Fadi Yazigi, here, Syrian artist, we have another story altogether. He lives in Damascus, where he's continued to live and work, and his work is characterized by extraordinary figures, part human, contorted. The emphasis is on the face, as though the body is a mere extension of the face. And you'll find his work on paper, in sculptures and paintings, and wonderful clay and bronze figures. He describes them as the people he sees around him. And in an interview, I found he makes this very interesting allusion to the past, expressing that continuity. Next slide, please. There is much poetry and intimacy in many of the works in the exhibition. And here, this is a wonderful work, 12 separate drawings, each in a tiny little square, and they're called Qissa, story, capturing a series of moods, perhaps, made by the Lebanese artist Afaf Zarek. Next slide, please. You see that I am galloping through, and I hope you're going to forgive me for this. These are works by Iranian artist Shida Tami, also tells a personal story. These 2 images come from a ring binder full of paintings. Each is on a metal sheet, usually used for radiographic plates, held together in a ring binder. And there are also handwritten words in Persian. And these poems ruminate on the passing of time, love, intimacy, and human fallibility. Next slide, please. Another story here, Canan Tolong, Turkish artist, 2 from a set of 33, which act as a memoir of the time that she was in a French hospital having contracted polio. And these are the people that she encountered. They're drawn on mylar. And she worked them and reworked them over many years. Next slide. We're now moving into a series of works which are to do with abstraction, starting with this work here. So this is another major theme of the exhibition. And this abstraction takes many forms of it, and I'll just take you through some of these works. Starting with Timo Nasri, some of you might have heard the talk last night at the Royal Drawing School between Timo Nasri, Walid Siti and myself, and it has been recorded. It's really well worth listening to. So this complex drawing really draws its inspiration from the mukarnas in Islamic architecture, which are essentially a series of niches. Timo has been drawing these for years with the white ink on the black paper, with ruler and compass. They're highly meditative within a structure that is utterly precise. Next slide, please. Munir and Nazgul Ansarinia take a different form, take their inspiration from something else architectural, and that is Persian mirror mosaic, which is known as Ayna Kari. And Munir, whose work is on the left, had been living in New York studying fashion and was friends with Andy Warhol, Frank Stella, and she returned to Iran and had an epiphany when she went to the Chahar Bagh in Shiraz, and she looked up at the ceiling and saw these magnificent mirrors, and it completely changed the course of her life. And she began making mirror sculptures and drawings too. Nazgul Ansarinia also was inspired by the mirror mosaic, the geometry of the mirror mosaic, but she turned this into something that is very political. So she has taken 2 newspaper articles which concern the sanctions on Iran, has cut them up and put them together so that they become meaningless. Next slide, please. So here it is architecture again. This is in a completely different form. This is YZ Kami's Endless Prayer, and it's the domes of the Persian buildings, and then he has pasted squares, which are fragments of poetry of the inspirational Jalaluddin Rumi. Next slide, please. Rumi also has inspired the work of the Saudi artist Dana Wartani, and this too is very meditative, where she deconstructs the shamsa, the feature in illumination that is found in Qur'ans, and she takes it from one stage to another. This is 3 from a set of 8, and in each one she's adding line and color. Next slide, please. This is Rashid Qureshi and another kind of abstraction using text. This really exemplifies his hallmark style, with text in all the directions you can imagine, backwards, forwards, signs and magical symbols. But this too has a very particular story, in that it is one of a set of 22 etchings from the series A Nation in Exile, which is a collaboration between Rashid Qureshi and the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. They met in Tunis in 1982. And Qureshi, you can see on the top the beginnings of this poem, which was translated by Lubna Fahum, about Darwish's friend Rashid Hassan, who he met in New York, not having seen him for a very, very long time. Next slide, please. Here we have abstraction based on the mashrabiyya, the wooden screens that you find in traditional architecture, particularly in Egypt and around also the rest of the Middle East. And Susan Hifuna worked with Cairene craftsmen to make these screens. We have one on display currently in the Africa Gallery. And from there, she created these wonderful layered drawings in a process that she likens to writing calligraphy. Next slide, please. Now we have Huguette Callan, another Lebanese artist, and this is about the purity of the line. Now she went from working on the figure, to pure abstraction in later life. Some of you may have seen a wonderful exhibition of her work at Tate St. Ives a year or so ago. Next slide, please. Another revered Lebanese artist, Nabil Nahas, who drew this drawing here, and we have a second one in the exhibition, when he studied in New York and spent time at the Met looking at Islamic art. And these drawings of a kind of, he does wonderful things with geometry, almost turning what is 2D actually into 3D. And so these were preparatory drawings for an amazing mural that still hangs in the Yale Chemistry building. Next slide, please. Fakhrunisa Zaid is another great figure. Some of you may have seen, again, the retrospective at Tate some years ago. And this drawing is from an absolutely remarkable book that is also in the Prints and Drawings department, which Roland Penrose, co-founder of the Institute of Contemporary Art, the ICA in London, would give to artists he knew or who'd exhibited at the ICA to draw in. And it includes, as I've put little snapshots of in the corner, sketches. Here you can see sketches by Dubuffet, by Chagall, by Henry Moore. And Fakhrunisa Zaid's were added during her exhibition at the ICA in July 1954. Next slide, please. And here we have another kind of abstraction. This is Mohammed Ibrahim from the UAE, and he paints these writings, as one can call them, his own language of signs and symbols on the walls of buildings and rock formations in and around his native Horfakan. And again, those of you who went to Sharjah will have seen a few years ago a wonderful series of exhibitions that were held there, including a whole room which was just full of these extraordinary drawings. Next slide, please. Now, this one is quite difficult to see. I appreciate that. It didn't matter how much I blew it up. But this is Nissen Constantini from Tunisia, and her abstraction is taking a very different form. And it's using text, and the words were taken out, leaving only the diacritical marks. Now, the text itself is by the mystic Ibn Arabi, and she's created in this work something as mysterious as the original text itself. Next slide, please. This is a work by the wonderful Turkish artist Burhan Doğançay, and it was the walls of the city of New York that inspired him when he moved there, the peeling posters, the graffiti on the walls. What's amazing about this work is that it's only when you get really close up to it that you realize that it's trompe-l'œil, that the layers are painted, and that it's not peeling sheets there. And this work cheers us all up, as you can see, and particularly it's called Look at the Bright Side. Next slide, please. This is Barbad Gulshiri, another form of trompe-l'œil, and it's called quad, and it alludes to several things. It's the exact size of Malevich's Black Square, a work that Gulshiri has found very inspirational, and he's made many works connected to the Black Square. Now, quad is also the Persian slang for prison, and the words in Persian that you see in this receding square tell the story of a prisoner in her cell, and how in solitary confinement she found a nail and began to draw. And there's a little bit of the text there. Next slide, please. And here the abstraction has a political meaning, taking us into the next section of the exhibition, but still within the abstraction part. And it's called Street, and it's about the degrading effect of sanctions in Iraq from the 1990s. And it's a very early stage of a work that Malala calls ruins technique. And we're going to see another example of it briefly from the Al-Bukhari gallery, part of the display. Next slide, please. Now, within Room 90 is, as I mentioned, there's a third section that we've called Tangled History, Tangled Histories. And it presupposes that you need to know something about the history of the Middle East and North Africa. So you're going to see a panel as you go in, which has got loads of key dates which relate to the works. And the the exhibitions, this part of the exhibition starts with the work of the Egyptian artist Mohamed Abla, who was present in Tahrir Square in 2011 at the time of the uprisings against Mubarak. And here he shows a group of people talking to policemen, something he said would never have happened before. And in a series of works, he really captures the spirit of what it was like to be in Tahrir Square at that time. Next slide, please. Now we move into what we could call almost a series of case studies, but that makes it seem too prescribed. They're really snapshots connected to moments in time and countries, and this is part of a sequence of works to do with Iran. This work by Mehdi Farhadian belongs to this sequence of works, which are really there to talk about revolution and obviously all sorts of different things connected to the recent history of Iran. And Mehdi loves processional arches, which were constructed all over Iran. And the inspiration for this particular example is a temporary structure set up in Tabriz in the early 20th century around the time of the Constitutional Revolution. And the pink wash and the ballerinas are contrasted with the cannons that you can see here. He calls it cannons and ballerinas. Next slide, please. From there, we move to Mossadegh, who was deposed in 1953, and we see him by CIA, US, by the US and Britain, in fact, and we see here him on the left as a sad and lonely figure drawn from the back with his cane in these absolutely beautiful prints that were made by Farid al-Shahi, but were made posthumously by Kav Editions. And then on the right, you see Shisha Garan's poster of Mossadegh there that was produced in 1979. The next slide is another history lesson, and this is Mitra Tabrizian's photograph, long photograph on the bottom there, and she's capturing 3 different moments of Iranian history, showing external complicity, as you can imagine. So to the left, we have the fall of Mossadegh, to the right, the return of Khomeini, and at the center, the effects of the Iran-Iraq war and much else. Now, at the top, we have the photographs, 2 photographs by Hengami Gulistan, which capture the demonstration that took place on March the 8th, 1979, when over 100,000 women took to the streets of Tehran to voice their opposition to the wearing of the hijab. Next slide, please. And this next group of slides really offer a few snapshots. We have Nahid Hakikat, who recalls growing up in Tehran when there was this atmosphere of fear and panic. So these are from 1977. And she evokes this in Surveillance, while in Escape, the next one, her protagonist discards the veil as a protest against patriarchal society. Next slide, please. Here we have Ramin Harizadeh, who's poking fun at the wearing of the hijab. Next slide, please. We have the satirist, Ardashir Muhasses on the left here. And as Nikki Nujumi describes, actually, with a few simple strokes, he would highlight oppression, corruption, and the humiliation of the individual and relentless mockery of the Pahlavi regime. Now, he left Iran in 1976, in fact, and remained in New York for the rest of his life. And he inspired absolute generation of artists, including Rokni Harizadeh on the right here. And Rokni is highlighting the time of the moment of the Green Revolution. He was in Dubai. He'd moved to Dubai by then. He was watching the protests through the television and then making these caricatures over the top. Next slide, please. Bahman Muhassas, another inspirational artist. He was a printmaker, he was involved in theatre and much else, spent much of his time in Rome. Some of you might have seen Mitra Farahani's film, FIFA Howls with Happiness, that we showed as part of an event with Magic of Persia at the BM a few years ago. He made these amazing collages, one of which echoes, the one in the center, echoes The Scream by Munch. And I wonder if you look closely, you can see the graffiti that the art world has suddenly become really preoccupied about on the Munch original. Next slide, please. Now, this is one of a series of works we're showing by Afsoon, who lives in London and talks about how Iran lives inside her and how she recreates it again and again. And I love this humorous take on nostalgia, the object through which the past speaks to you. And Afsoon will be talking at one of the BM events in a couple of weeks with Mahmoud Obeidi, Almir Kolzik and Joe Glanville. And the event will be up soon. The next slide, please. Nusha Tabakolian. This is the last of the works in the Iranian section here. And it's a book in which she imagines filling in the pages of a blank family album. And we see Bita on the left, pictured perhaps at her birthday party. And then in this wonderful fold-out book, you then get snapshots of her life. And then this text written, as it were, by her, talking about her life now. Next slide, please. Now, of course, the Israel-Palestine conflict continues to dominate the politics of the region, and this slide and the next are four works from a remarkable series that we were able to acquire called 35 Years of Occupation, made in 2002, which marks 35 years since 1967. It was made by 35 Palestinian and Israeli artists in an edition of 35. Taysir Barakat and Larry Abramson were two of its founders. And alongside the portfolio is a joint statement, Hoping for Peace, an extract of which is on the screen. Next slide, please. Two further works from this series by Emily Jassir, The Journey of the Return, The Footsteps Going Round and Round, coming from a big splash of coffee, and on the other side, Michal Rovna, Evoking the Mistrust of the Other. Next slide, please. On this wall, we've placed four works by Palestinian artists, which talk about the conflicts and its results seen through the prism of their experience. And above them on the wall, we've got some text, which is a line from Mahmoud Darwish, I am the land and the land is you. Next slide, please. So now we're in Lebanon. So the Lebanese Civil War, which began in 1975, went on for 15 years. Some say it never really came to a conclusion. And so many of these issues were raised by that terrible explosion that wreaked so much destruction and killed so many people in August of last year. And here we have three artists who are expressing the war in three completely different ways. So we have on the left one of a series of prints by Aris Reyes from his Road to Peace. These were all made in 1 year, 76, and the originals were sadly lost during the war. Raed Yassin in the center, one of very few ceramics that we have acquired, who actually has put key moments of the Lebanese Civil War onto these wonderful vases, which were made in China, Jingzhen. And then John Durage, this is one of two pictures we've got from a big series of 20, who took photographs and he printed them onto vellum and he burnt the eyes of them. So by this series, which he calls Untitled Men, We Could Be Heroes, he's pinpointing those involved or those who are responsible for the Civil War. And this is Rashid Karami there. Next, please. And this is Laure Reib, who tells, in this remarkable work, she tells the history of the conflict in Lebanon from the beginning of the 20th century, all the different wars that have taken place and revolutions and so on. She sets it in the middle of the Civil War in 1984, and it's as though mother speaking to her daughter, and all the way, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a kind of landscape in the two faces, and little villages and streets and paths and all of this wonderful text there. Next, please. We now move to Iraq, moving swiftly on. So here I'm going to show you a few snapshots. This is one of two drawings that we acquired actually quite a long time ago, quite remarkable. This is a preparatory sketch for the Freedom Monument, the Nasb al-Hurriya, which was commissioned in 1959 to celebrate the revolution in Iraq of the previous year. It was inspired by the monumental gates of Babylon, and it's a visual narrative expressing themes of injustice, resistance, solidarity, in the style of the symbolic realism. Sadly, Jawad Salim, a very great artist, died before he could see it completed. Next slide, please. Jamal Penjwani's darkly comical photographs here, Saddam is here, he calls them, where he questioned people after the Iraq War, which began in 2003, with the fall of Saddam, and with the realization that Saddam was actually still present in everyone's lives, and the effects of what he did, and the terrible mess that ensued when he left. Well, when all of that came to an end, of course. Jamal represented Iraq at the Ruya Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, where I first saw these works and was so struck by them. Next slide, please. Now, these works are all about the destruction of heritage in Iraq. We have Rafa Nasri on the right, who evokes the burning of the National Library in Baghdad in 2003, and then Walid Sitti on the left, who takes icons of the architecture and history of Iraq, ziggurats, the Malwiya, and he often depicts them against these devastated landscapes. Now, Syria. Next slide, please, sorry. And we have a number of works that talk about Syria, starting with this beautiful work here by Elias Zayat, wonderful drawing, one of two we have. And Zayat was one of the founders of the Iraqi art school, the Faculty of Fine Arts at the University of Damascus, which was established in 1960. And he evokes ancient mythologies in his work and focuses on Palmyra particularly. Next slide, please. Here we've got Yusuf Abdelki on the left, three sinister figures. This was done in the 90s, and Abdelki spent time in prison in the 70s, and then was arrested briefly again in 2013 following the Syrian uprisings. These other two groups of works are really works which were created post the Syrian uprisings of 2011. Each of these two groups are really like personal narratives. Suleiman, whose works are on the bottom there, became famous for his work, which is sort of like a graphic novel called The Freedom Hospital. And Azza, this is one of her works above, created these very haunting etchings in the style of Goya that she calls traces. Next slide, please. And then we have on the left, Sulafa Hijazi, digital artist and filmmaker. She began producing this series she calls Ongoing in 2011. And these images were all circulating online. Here she's evoking chemical attacks, but in this very stark imagery here. And digital played a huge role in the early days of the uprisings. And we have in the center a poster from this Syrian collective, The Syrian People Know Their Way. These were circulated on digital media and then printed out and take on demonstrations and so on. And thanks to Malu Halasa, who will be chairing next week's wonderful panel, which will be about Syria, with Sulafa Hijazi, with Issam Kurbaj and Charlotte Banks, and we'll hear a lot more about this. And then we have another work on the right by Monif Hajjaj. Next slide, please. Now, Tunisia is where, of course, as you know, the so-called Arab Spring started in 2011. And the art that's being made now is, I think, incredibly interesting because there's a number of artists who are really looking at history. And in this work here, Malik Gnawi shows details of marble sculptures from the ancient city of Carthage, which are in the Bardo Museum. And they're rendered in brick dust rather than, of course, the original marble. And they're crushed and turned into this pigment. And Gnawi addresses Tunisian history and the loss and destruction of civilizations as evoked by the historian Ibn Khaldun. Next slide, please. Then we have here Nidal Chamer, whose interest really lies in neglected moments of history of Tunisia. And here he's telling the story of the many French troops that helped the French during the war, the Second World War particularly, and who were afterwards cast aside and forgotten. Hela Ammar, in these two extraordinary works, she repurposes editions of the Journal Officiel to comment on significant moments in the history of Tunisia, particularly Tunisia gained independence from France in 1956, but the French troops remained at the naval base of Bizerte. And in 1961 there was a bloody battle, and then it wasn't until 1963 that the last French soldier left Tunisia when the crown was complete. Next slide, please. Here we have another history, but from another part of the world, from Saudi Arabia, the beginnings of the oil industry there. And this is Manal Doyan's also personal story, because this is where she grew up. Next slide, please. Then in these last few works, we have very haunting works here by Paul Geragossian, another very significant Lebanese artist who is also Armenian. And these works really mark the genocide that affected his family. It was a series that he did in 1984. And his mother, who he evokes here in this haunting image on the right, was carrying the child that she lost in the ordeal of the march across the desert to Deir ez-Zor. Next slide, please. And here we have a series of very poignant photographs by Leila Alawi, wonderful photographer who was killed very sadly in Burkina Faso. And so this picture is really, it's evoking the dreams of a young Moroccan who is wanting to leave. We can imagine all sorts of things when we look at that picture. Next slide, please. This is a further series that she did of refugees on the Syria-Lebanese border in a series that's called We Are Waiting, Natrin. Next slide, please. And then the last work that you'll see when you leave room 90 is this beautiful work that we fairly recently acquired by Ibrahim Salahi, which he made in 1969. Now, I'm just in the last couple of minutes going to show you some works that are in the Al-Bukhari gallery. So I'll just very quickly whiz through those. Next slide, please. So the Al-Bukhari gallery, we opened this in autumn 2018. This is an amazing team effort between a group of colleagues who include Zeina Klinkhop, Famida Suleiman, Ladan Akbarnia, and we worked on this project for many years, and contemporary art was always to have its place following the historical section of the Islamic art part of the gallery. So we've been able to put contemporary works in there, which is a really wonderful thing. And so for those of you who know the gallery, the end wall previously had an amazing work that was a CaMMEA commission by Idris Khan. Now we have a beautiful work called Faces by Khalil Jurej and Joanna Haji Thomas. And what they've done in this extraordinary work is that they are commemorating the many dead from the Civil War and even later, and through a series of posters that they've captured. You know, in the Middle East, when somebody dies, they'll put up a picture, sometimes multiple pictures, which have black frames around them. So they captured these posters in different moments of degradation, and then and then sometimes they would actually draw over the top of them, so that it actually kind of brings them to life again. Next slide, please. And this is a work by Hera Buyuktashian, and she's highlighting the invisibility of history, the aquatic nature of memory. And actually, this is a story about Punjab in 1947, really, is what happened there following partition. And she traveled around the region, and she was very struck by these, what she called ghost buildings. Anyway, next slide, please. Then we have MECAT. I'm aware I've just got a couple more minutes, Louisa, so don't panic. This is one of a beautiful set of images, which is a photographic essay in which MECAT set out to discover the old city of Jeddah, which is known as Balad, which he knew from a child. And I love the way he describes how he waits for the light to invite him in so that he can take his pictures. And then the next slide, please. We have Lulu Al-Hamoud, who has created her own language to recreate the names of God, the Asma al-Husna, which is based on the 9x9 table known as the Vedic square. Next slide, please. And here we have Farah Usuli, which is like a version of a Persian miniature, but actually it's all about honor killing. Next slide, please. And then these works here are also inspired by sort of different aspects of Iranian art, really, and history. So we have Feridun Arv's Pahlavan here. So he's evoking the trials of Rustam. And then these two other interesting works here, Mohammed Baranji, Iman Raj. Next slide, please. And then we have showing a number of artist books as well, which are some of my favorite objects of all time. And artist books known as Dafatir are particularly made by Iraqi artists. It was Azzawi who actually inspired all these artists to make such books. Next slide, please. And this is an extraordinary one called Compact Home. Next slide, please. And then there are a series of works in which we're evoking migration, and starting with that work that I started with, the Taysir Batniji work up at the top there, and then showing these other works that you can see. Steve Sabella, it's work on a stone, actually. It's a very nostalgic work. And Ipek Duban here, and Amal Freyhachlat, which actually is talking about Syria. Next slide, please. I'll come back to Syria for the last slide. This is the penultimate slide, I think. And there's a section on Yemen. And we're showing these beautiful photographs on the left. You can see it's one of 12 by Yusuf Nabil. And these are of the last generation of Yemeni sailors who came to the UK. And there's a very interesting text connected to one of them. So they left Yemen and they came to live in the UK, and then they would return. And then what is it about that return? What is that relationship with your country once you've left it? And we've also put some works here by very interesting Yemeni artists who uses fabric in a completely different way, called Ali, sorry, excuse me. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. These are these extraordinary little boats that Aysam Kurbaj created, and they are they're evoking the plight of Syrian migrants, and they became the object 101 in the history of the world in 100 objects. Some of you may remember this, and Neil McGregor chose this as the object 101, and you'll be hearing a lot about this work in Malu Halas's session next week. So that brings me to the end of my slides, and I'm sorry about this kind of incredible gallop through all these works, and I hope I've left a few moments for questions. Thank you so much.
Well done, Venetia. That was breakneck speed and so many wonderful things. Thank you so much. Firstly, I'd like to ask, have you started installing? Have you finished installing? Where are you in terms of creating the display?
We have actually very nearly finished the installation, and it's looking absolutely lovely. And I think the last piece is going to be installed tomorrow, and then next week we're going to be putting the labels and information panels and doing the lighting and all of that. So that's very exciting.
Oh, how exciting! Gosh, I can't wait to see it. As it transpires, many people who are watching tonight, we've had several wonderful questions. The first I would like to present is from actually my colleague, Maisa Kaf Al-Hussein, who really just wanted to ask how you decided which works made it into this exhibition. You've obviously got so many in a vast institution like VM. How did you begin to get your chopsticks out?
That question of which works was, I have to say, a bit of a nightmare, because what with COVID and all of this, I had to reduce the number of works, which was very painful. And you know me, Louisa, it's always, well, can I have another piece here? And so wonderful John Old was very strict with me. And he's always right, actually. And so it was very difficult to choose. And so I think in the end it was what worked, what there was space for, and I hope that people will like it.
I also have a question here from Jan Winter, asking about translations of texts either appearing in the works or appearing in the exhibition. And I remember you telling me that you're going to have quotations in the exhibition. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, so yes, there are a lot of translations of, there are a number of translations of poems, for example. There are texts on the walls, so they are in English. We haven't put them in their original language, but yes, I think literature is so important, and it informs so much, and it also just gives you another aspect to this.
And if there are decorative elements in the works, fragmentary bits, will there be a way of the audience knowing what they're saying?
Well, hopefully, yes, but you know also how strict interpretation is about the number of words. So I'm hoping that people will also find that information if it's not there on the British Museum website, because all the works are on collections online. It's not by any means complete yet, but will be in the next few weeks. And those kinds of things I'm paying particular attention to make sure that where there is text, that it's actually translated and there.
Okay, we have two more questions, which I am going to cover, and then I want to ask you the very last question myself. Somebody called Camilla Etzi Selmi asked how the exhibition is going to be organised, and I think actually your presentation covered the layout, so you'll have to come and see if you want to get some more details on that. And two people, one lady called Agnes and a gentleman called Hassan, have asked for a bit more elucidation about the problematic term Middle East and North Africa. I would like to refer them to your book, to pages 17 to 18, where you have dealt with this very nicely, but you have essentially said that they are problematic terms and that there is a risk of using all of these terms, including Middle East, which is one that stems from colonial history. And the very last sentence of this paragraph, you say, as this material increasingly finds its place within international art, it is hoped that a new generation will develop terms based on the art itself and not where it was made and by whom. So I would urge you to read the rest of the essay. My very last question is, where next for the collection after this exhibition?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, the collection is not even remotely comprehensive, and nor is it intended to be. It's just what we've been able to collect up until now, and there is so much out there that is extraordinarily interesting. So, of course, there are Egyptian artists to collect. Particular area that I'm beginning to focus on now is Yemen, and I want to try and do the same as we did with Syria, because the interesting thing with Syria was that we were able to kind of get a concentration of works, maybe 20, 25 works, and then all of those posters, like 70 of them, which the wonderful Fergus, of course, had translated for us. And so I want to try and do the same with Yemen, because despite all the terrible things that are going on there is some very interesting works by artists who are in Yemen itself, but also who are in outside, who are in diaspora, and there's a whole area to be studied there. So that's something that I want to do. That is kind of my next project, but it'll take time, to do the research and so on.
Well, we can't wait to see the exhibition. We can't wait to see what comes afterwards. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. I must very speedily thank Venetia for her time and excellent presentation, and to all of you for joining us and listening, and for the excellent questions some of you have asked. I would urge you all to join Venetia for yet more upcoming events associated with the exhibition during the next couple of months. Details can be found on the BM website. You can also find the book there. Please do go and buy a copy. One lady did ask if there was a discount, and I think you'll have to take that up with the BM directly. And we all look forward to seeing you again, or indeed for the first time, at the British Museum when it reopens to the public. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much, Louisa.